Why do you think chancellors have ducked these sorts of reforms for as long as they have?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I would try and persuade a backbench MP to pass a law that would identify the psychological frailties in prospective chancellors and ban anyone who is prone to making the tax system more complicated from being chancellor.
I always get a bit depressed when people say things like, oh, well, the public wouldn't take it. I think that's just really insulting, actually, to the public. The public aren't stupid. And of course, they're not tax experts. They're trying to get their tea on the table and stuff. They don't need to be tax experts. But I absolutely think that if politicians went out and made the case some of this stuff and explained it in clear language and said why we're doing it, I don't believe at all the story that the public wouldn't buy it.
I'm Joe Owen, Director of Policy at Nesta, the Research and Innovation Foundation, and this is the first episode of our new podcast. Each episode, we will take a policy problem and then look at the solutions for fixing it. We'll look at the challenge, what works, and then how to make change happen. If you like this episode, please subscribe and share it with the policy nerds in your life. Our first episode, we're looking at the UK's fiendishly complicated tax system. And joining me to discuss it, we have got two properly brilliant economists with very strong views on tax. Our very own Tim Leunig, Chief Economist at Nesta, and Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So I've been reading the various compliments that you two have given the UK's tax system. They include irrational, a mess, and a nightmare. So to kick things off, I'd like to ask you to put a bit of meat on the bones of those critiques. How does our tax system hold us back, particularly if we want the economy to succeed?
That's where I start. So look, the tax system is not a complete disaster in the sense that we should remember that the tax system is first and foremost there to bring in revenue, and it is bringing in a lot of revenue. It's due to bring in something like 1.3 trillion in the coming years. And in that sense, it's a success. It's sort of doing its main aim. And of course, people will differ in what they think about how high taxes are, and they'll differ in terms of who they think should pay taxes. Some people want rich people to pay more or less. But when we're talking about the tax system as being a mess, what I have in mind is that however much money you want to raise, whoever you want to raise it from, we are raising taxes in ways that are doing more damage than necessary. And when I say that, what do I mean? I mean taxes are distorting how much people work, how much they save, where they go to work, which houses they buy, and so on and so on and so on. So it's doing all sorts of things that hold us back, whether that's in terms of how many hours are worked or how much is spent or who moves around the country. And ultimately, when you're doing that, when you're affecting all those decisions, you're making us poorer. Because if we weren't doing that, people would make different decisions and we'd be better off. So it's not about I'm not saying it's a mess because I think it's too high or too low or less redistributive. It really is saying the kind of underlying structure of the system, the way we design it, is more damaging than it needed to be given whatever goals you might have.
Tim.
So to give some specific examples, if you look at the data, there are a lot of people who stop work when they get to £50,000. Because if you're a parent, you lose your child benefit. So you gain £1 and you lose all of the child benefit. So they go into their boss and they say, hey, can I work a fewer hours a week? Or can I have a week of unpaid leave? And we find there's this vast number of people who'd love to work an extra week. We'd love them to work an extra week. That's an extra week of GDP. And the only reason they're not doing it is because the tax system is penalising them. And there are so many things like that.
So
barking.
So with this scope for reform in which, as you say, the government wants certain things from the system, but it's shoving the wrong incentives in the way that the system is designed. I know you're both economists, but there's sort of politics to this, right? And I think most people agree that the last big set of reforms were probably under Thatcher. Why do you think chancellors have ducked these sorts of reforms for as long as they have?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I would try and persuade a backbench MP to pass a law that would identify the psychological frailties in prospective chancellors and ban anyone who is prone to making the tax system more complicated from being chancellor.
So you have no theories about what those frailties might be?
I think it is a lot about guts.
Yeah.
Nigel Lawson, who was a great reforming chancellor in the technical sense that he made the tax system simpler, was a politician. He had political beliefs, he had political interests, but he didn't see them as incompatible with a better tax system. But since then, we've had people who frankly are a bunch of meddlers who want to do things for a one-day headline, even if it makes us worse off in the long run. And that's a huge shame.
Well, I think I've often cited the Lawson reforms as examples of reform. I think it's unfair to say there's been no reform since then. I mean, the tax system has changed hugely, and you can point to some areas of that where I think it would be in the bucket of what Tim and I would call a reform. So without, there were big changes to corporation tax structures in the 2010s. The introduction of ISAs, so tax-free saving vehicles, was a big change in the structure of the tax system. And there are other things like that. I think it's a few things that are different. Is that one is when you look at what chancellors do, they'll often do something that's in the right direction, but they'll do 5 other things that are in the wrong direction. And therefore, it's hard to see it as a systematic move towards a better structure. I think it's also something about the language and the motivation. So the Lawson reforms were very much, and I've read the budget speeches recently for a different reason, they're all couched in the language of kind of wanting to reform something and making the case for for that. I think when politicians since then have done big reforms, they haven't tended to use that language. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can find other ways to talk about it, and you shouldn't be doing reform for some dry technical reason. It's ultimately about living standards. But I think it's rarer now for politicians to grasp it as a kind of this reform thing, this concept that's not about redistribution, it's not about revenue raising or cutting. This thing could be the path. It's also worth noting, to be fair, that things are tougher when you're trying to do reform in a world where the public finances are tight. If you're in a world where there's money to give away, or maybe there's some scope to doing something, it's a bit easier to do reform. So if you're doing it while you're trying to hold back public spending, I think it is a bit harder. But then there's all the politics about, I think we have a tendency in this country where politicians want to do new things. New things are more exciting. You have a new label and you do something new and you bolt something on top, as opposed to fixing what's already there. And a lot of what we need in reform is about ignore the new stuff, do something to the structure. And I think that's become less exciting for politicians.
I think so. I think Helen's being far too nice to recent politicians, because there's a whole bunch of tax reform that would raise revenue. Getting rid of all the sort of VAT exemptions would raise revenue. And of course, right back in 1979, Geoffrey Howe did harmonise VAT by moving from 2 rates to 1 much higher rate. That was a simplification. It raised a lot of money. So even if you need to raise a lot of money, you can still simplify the tax system.
And there's something when I was doing research for this, looking at what has changed in the last sort of 10, 15 years. And although, as you say, the sort of structure hasn't changed, looking through some of the numbers of the 40% higher rate threshold on income tax has fallen by about 18k in real terms since 2010. The number of taxpayers paying the higher rate has doubled. The number paying the additional rate is quadrupled. So we've seen quite a lot of actual change in who pays what, but the structures are there. Is that's just because those are quiet changes that chancellors can make at the budget that, as you say, don't come across as a big reform. They don't require loads of bravery, but they have change the structure of the system in terms of who pays what at how much.
But it's also partly what I said right at the top. It's about what politicians are trying to do, right? So, Tim and I know we're not making party political points when we say we want to improve the structure of the tax system. I think every political party could get on board in that. But there are going to be other things that politicians want to do with the structure of the tax system for redistributive reasons, for example. So some of these things you're pointing to, there's been a choice to get more people paying tax or more of them paying the higher rate. And that's fine. That's not against what we're saying. That's just that there's a different thing you do with the tax system. So I think there are some things that fall into that bucket. I think there are other things that look more like they could be a reform. But either, again, there's some things in different directions or they're partial. Take a recent example. There's now a new surcharge in council tax for higher value properties. I think Tim and I are both on record saying that council tax is absurd for lots of reasons, including that it's based on 1991 values and it's regressive and all that stuff. Now, you could say, well, they've got this new charge, it's a step in the right direction. But is it? Is it a step to anywhere? I don't know. They haven't said it. And actually, in the meantime, it's actually what it is, a new bolt-on and with lots of complexity. So that's an example where if you were feeling really generous, you could say, well, they're trying to reform it. Or you could say, no, they've dodged the bullet. They've just shoved something else on top and they've done a fix. That's the kind of thing I mean. I think even when they might have alighted on an issue, they're not really grappling with the underlying structure. Or another example, we have maybe we'll come back to this. There are huge differences in how we tax different forms of income, which have a whole laundry list worth of problems. And some chancellors have tried to chip away at that problem, But what this Chancellor does also is put up employer national insurance, which makes some of those problems worse. So even if you can point to some other cases where some bits have got better, it's not that consistent. I've got a vision when we're moving systematically towards it. It's like, well, this is better and this is worse. I think that's part of the problem.
So before we move on to the sort of solutions and some of those visions could be and what some of the opportunities are, I want to get your laundry list. And
how many hours do you have, boss?
Like
The whole podcast.
What are the biggest horrors in the system? Where are there kind of zombie taxes lurking or like mad relics that you think just need to be dealt with? Tim?
So there are lots of funny little ones that are absurd and small. That if you have more than 2 dots of chocolate on a gingerbread man, the biscuit has VAT on it. If you don't, it doesn't. It's absurd. It should obviously be changed. Am I going to claim that's the biggest issue? No, I'm not. The biggest issue is probably the fact that if you get income in column A, you pay a lot less tax than in column B. So if you're self-employed, you pay less national insurance. You certainly don't pay employers' national insurance. If you're employed, you pay rather more. If you can take your income as a dividend, you'll pay even less still. So if I had to name one really big problem in terms of its economic effect, I would say it's the distortions in how people receive income, as dividends, as self-employed, or as PAYE earnings. And that one I definitely think we should tackle. Because if we did, fewer people will be self-employed, more people will be employed. And the evidence is that people who are employed earn more. They have higher benefits for society as a whole. They pay more in tax. Big companies are more productive than small companies, and so on and so forth. So if I had to say one, that's the one I'd go for.
And actually, for what it's worth, I'd pick that one too. I've spent my career. We can pick some more as well. There are plenty of others, don't worry. But I think it's worth. That's a great case study of some of the points we were talking about earlier, because there are these absurd differences. But the rate differences are very salient. So you can just see that some things are taxed at higher rates than others. And people sort of know intuitively that's unfair usually. Why is it hard to get rid of? Well, one of the reasons it's hard to get rid of is because, and actually Philip Hammond tried to do this, the minute you try and increase taxes on business owners, you have these calls, oh my God, the entrepreneurs, the investment, we can't do that, that's bad for investment. And the key to that whole debate is to understand that it's not just tax rates that matter, it's the tax base. So the definition of what's actually taxed in the first place. And without wanting to get too in the weeds, I mean, basically, we should be thinking of income from work. Like I go to work every day, I get an income. That is different from running a business. But why is it different? It's not about the extra pound of return on my labour. It's about I might put my own money into the business, I might have taken a risk. But the way to reflect that is through the tax base, through deductions, for example. So, but all the time that we ignore that tax base piece, then you put rates up, you make some problems better and some problems worse. And we just yo-yo, like capital gains tax is an example of this. We yo-yo around in the rates. We pick higher rates, good for fairness, bad for investment. We pick lower rates, good for investment, bad for fairness. Instead of just saying, actually, why are we doing things like taxing inflation? That's stupid. Fix the tax base. With the tax base fixed, you could fix these problems. So, and to your point earlier, but why don't we see these things? That's a case where, because it's a bit more technical, I can explain in 20 seconds, as Tim just did, why the rates are salient and problematic. It's much harder to explain quickly why the level of deductions for investment costs and interest is set at the wrong level. But unless that becomes a core part of the debate, we'll never fix that problem, because all you're doing is moving the rate. So I think that's a good example where it's right across the tax system. It's just pervasive. It's kind of at the heart. It's where personal taxes and corporate taxes all come together in the middle of the tax system. But we have to have the tax base, I think, be a core part of any debate about that.
And that tax base is what underlines the problem with VAT.
Yeah.
Only about half of goods in Britain have VAT on. And some people think VAT is a tax on luxury goods, and it really isn't. It's a tax on a fairly random and arbitrary set of goods. So from memory, there is no VAT on chocolate-flavoured milkshake, but there is VAT on strawberry-flavoured milkshake. Now, I cannot think of any circumstances in any rationality for that. There is VAT on muesli bars, but not on flapjacks. And the definition of a flapjack is that it's a posh muesli bar. Literally, that is the official legal definition, because it went to court and a judge decided that a flapjack is something you would serve to a distinguished visitor with a cup of tea in the afternoon. And if your product passes that test, you don't have to pay VAT. Yeah. So again, it's not about the rate of VAT, it's about the base. And that's why, and I will die on this hill, everything should have VAT on it, because any time you move away from that, you create some distortion at the margin. And New Zealand has that system. The only thing you don't pay VAT on in New Zealand, from memory, is buying or renting a house. life insurance.
We'll have to find something to disagree on in a minute to make it clear.
It's really hard.
I completely agree. I think the VAT system is mad. But just on that, again, as another example, I would take all the zero rates away, all the exemptions away, whack full rate VAT and everything. But that would have big distributional consequences. And that's a political choice whether we want to do that. So why would I put that in the bucket of reform as opposed to distributional choices? It's because you could do that, take all that money you raise, which is something like, it depends if you do exemptions or not, but 80 billion-ish, use that to more directly help poor people. So if what you want to do is help poor people, which is a perfectly valid, obviously, political goal, doing it through the VAT system, like children's clothing. Who spends tons of money on children's clothing? Not poor people. Although they spend some money, but not as much as the better off people. So the reason I have it in my reform bucket is because, I wouldn't say to a politician, just put the rates up, just change the base and put the rates up, because that would be a big revenue raise. But you could redistribute and get a better or a same distributional outcome without all these silly and these ridiculous court cases where we have real human talent being wasted working out like how much potato starch is in a particular kind of fried snack. It's absurd.
Okay, so you're both prepared to die on the flapjack hill.
We will die on the flapjack hill, and we'll die on the muesli hill, and furthermore, we'll agree there is no difference between those hills.
Good. So we started to do it already, but I wanted to move us into the sort of solution space. And I guess, you've talked about some kind of big structural reforms that you can make. But if you were the Chancellor, what are the sort of first almost quite tactical, practical steps you would start taking in some of those areas to drive reform? Because it's sort of easy to paint nirvana, but then what would you do in the next 12 months, for example, to start trying to get there on some of those?
But I think that step one, it really is important. I've become to believe this more and more as I've worked on this more and more. I think step one has to be get a vision.
Yeah.
I think it's absolute. You have to know what you think a good tax system would look like. And not that you think you can get there in this parliament necessarily, but without knowing, I call it a North Star, but having your North Star of where you want to be, you're never going to be able to plot a path towards it. So I think you first have to know, what do you think a good system? And I have that vision, Tim has a vision, they're probably not quite identical, but we have one. So as a Chancellor, I think you have to have a vision. Then you've got to make a decision about, okay, politically, where will I burn some political capital? Where will I put some effort? No one, I don't think, thinks that you're going to change the entire tax system in a parliament or in 12 months. You're not. That's a huge job. And some of the changes that might advocate, or I'm saying I would advocate, would be technical and need some work done. They'd need some different administrative mechanisms. You couldn't do it all in 12 months. You could do lots of it, but not all of it. So I think you have to first get a clear vision and then sort of pick your battles and decide where to put your effort. And then there isn't sort of a one size fits all answer to your question, I don't think, because it depends on what you picked as to what you might chip away at. But let's just take housing, because I think you might find something to disagree on. But the Chancellor, and the reason I'm picking that one is partly because the Chancellor has already said that building's a big part of what she wants to achieve. She wants to have less restrictive planning laws. They have done something on council tax. That's an area where actually, so first step, don't make it worse. And she did increase stamp duty, which is an embarrassment as far as I'm concerned in our tax system. So at least that's made a system worse. So not making it worse would be better. But you can imagine plotting something, and I'll stop it so Tim can jump in, but that says, actually we're going to reduce a bit of stamp duty, do this to council tax as a step towards something else. I mean, I'd love to see a big bang, actually, that just removes stamp duty, but at least you could start plotting a path to something, given that you're already working in the housing area.
So I think we do have a disagreement here. Not on the ends, but on the means. Because I think I am more radical than you are. I think you could stand up in a budget and say, VAT is going to be levied on everything. That would be straightforward. We already have a VAT system. Everybody knows that whatever they do is encompassed within the words everything.
Yeah.
So there's no definitional issues. And then if there are no exemptions, you said earlier that's about 80 billion. So you could then stand up and say, and we're going to knock 5p off the rate of income tax, and we're going to spend 20 billion improving welfare benefits, including the state pension.
I agree with that, yeah.
And at that point, what I think politicians have to do is not to get a dead cat. There's this talk of a dead cat bouncing. And I've never seen anybody drop a dead cat in reality, and I doubt they bounce very well. But even if a dead cat was dropped on this table and bounced once, it's not going to do anything after that. A dead cat is very soon very boring and just a problem. What you need to do to win a battle is have a live cat bounce. So I do once recall my own cat falling off the roof of the house, shooting past my bedroom window upside down with a howl, and by the time I ran down, my cat had turned itself up the right way and was bounding up the garden path, because a live cat is much more interesting. And what we need here is a live cat of saying, right, we're going to knock 3p off income tax, we're going to add 50 quid to the pension, we're going to drop all these crazy rules on benefits, and then you've got a story to tell. And if you've moved the story away from VAT and tax reform, you've achieved the tax reform, but you've got a positive story to tell. What is being bought with the money?
And actually, on that again, I really want to find a way to disagree because it's fun. But I'm told often, I get to do these talks a lot now. People always ask me what's happening, and I hear reflected from a lot of maybe special advisors or politicians or that big is risky. Right, and therefore you want the small things, you want the small steps, and there are some cases, if it's very technical, you think actually you need to do some consultation on the way, where you do, like it's like a very technical part of corporation tax. Maybe you do want to just make small and work it out and collect some evidence along the way. So there are cases for that, but I think often there's a kind of a political and I'm not a political person, but political miscalculation in thinking that smaller is easier. But think about another example I like to use. George Osborne tried to put VAT on pasties, and it was an omnichannel. It was a disaster. Yet the VAT rate went up from 17.5% to 20%, not a peep. And I think Tim's on something here with if it's bigger, I think there's a few things it's got in its favour. One is that you can make the case for it's like we're doing this for a good reason. It's about living standards. It's about like I'm doing the right thing, and it's big enough that it actually moves the dial. You can then do a package of things that actually it's not just about I picked on you for your winter fuel payments, or I picked on you farmers and IHT, or I picked on you pasty eaters, where you feel like there's a group who feel like they're picked on. Actually, it's everyone. We're all in it together. And it's part of something bigger. So I actually think that the political calculation that small is easier is wrong. And actually, sometimes bigger reforms that encompass more people, that have more narrative around them, that are done for a higher level reason, my guess that actually they'd be less risky, not more risky.
And presumably you raise more money, which allows you to spend on other things, even for those groups that might be affected as a result of the tax change. So you can sort of start to smooth over rather than it feeling like indiscriminate punches.
Well, in that case you do, but of course, the nature of reform is that there's often a case where you want to give away money. So scrapping stamp duty will be a big giveaway. So often what you want to do if you're clever, again, this is the very nature of reform, and my definition of reform is that it's not about revenue giving away or raising. So you find that what are the combination of things you can do that don't have a big revenue effect, and that how can you offset the distributional consequences. Now, with that in hand, you might then want to have distributional consequences. You might want to change who pays, you might want to raise more or less, but I don't think I think you should think of those things separately, because I think actually there's a lot that you could do that was actually just saying, like in Tim's example, you do the VAT base and you give it away, or you scrap stamp duty but you also increase council tax. It's a revenue neutral, but you've got rid of a bad tax and increased and made an okay tax better. So I think it's not, if you are going to give away revenue, you're going to have distributional consequences or something else as well, and that should be seen, I think, as a bit of a separable choice to the kind of reforms that we're talking about.
On property tax, Tim, you've got a pitch. What's your pitch for how we should reform property taxes and stamp duty?
So all economists start from the idea that stamp duty is a terrible tax because it's a tax on moving. And we don't want to stop people moving house. We want people to move for opportunity. We want them to move for better jobs. We want them to be able to move to be nearer family members who might need support, whether that's older people looking after grandchildren or people looking after elderly relatives. There are so many reasons to stop penalising people who move. And that means that stamp duty just has to go, or it has to be reduced to the sort of tiny levels it was back in 1996 when I bought my first house. And I remember buying my first house and I did pay a small amount of stamp duty, but it really wasn't meaningful.
Whereas I'm stuck in a house that's too small for my family, because the idea of having to pay the stamp duty means that I've got to make the optimal move for my next house forever because I can't afford to move again. So and the level really matters, not just its existence.
And Helen here is in a very typical position. And actually we found with Help to Buy that the average house bought by a first-time buyer had 3 bedrooms. And that's just absurd. And when we went out and did some work on this and we asked them why, they said, well, we don't want to pay stamp duty twice. So we've got all these people under-occupying houses, which we're rather short of, in order to reduce the tax they have to pay. And that is the definition of a badly paid tax.
So abolish stamp duty.
So abolish, and I would replace stamp duty with anything or nothing. I'd be willing to put up income tax or VAT or reform capital gains tax and take it back to the Lawson system where you don't pay on inflation and then you pay at your marginal rate, which I think raises 10, 12 billion and would allow me to abolish stamp duty. So almost no matter what, I will abolish stamp duty. But a more sensible tax would be to have an annual tax that you pay for as long as you live in the house, a sort of super version of council tax, levied on the value. In my view, it should be the original value you paid for it, because they're indexed to inflation, because then you know the liability you're signing up for. I am worried about linking it to the current value, because some people's houses do shoot up in value, and they could be walloped by costs they didn't understand when they did it. So I think people should know what the tax liability is when they buy a house. But yes, the basic point of a small annual tax rather than a big one-off tax, absolutely, slam dunk. And I don't think you'll find a single economist in the country who would disagree with us on that. And if they claim they disagree, they're just looking to get in the news.
Send them our way. But also, I think, but what you'll hear is that, okay, the politics is too hard. A lot of Londoners will pay higher taxes, and isn't that difficult? But again, a politician, you could imagine making the case for it and actually saying, well, the current system is really unfair. Here are the list of people, as Tim studied, that are currently penalised, and here are the people who would pay maybe lower. If you had a reform council, you could actually put lower at the bottom maybe. So here are the people who would benefit from this, and make a case. It's not about these people over here I want to tax because these are the people I don't like. That's a really difficult argument to make, as opposed to this system is structurally unfair. And to remove that unfairness, it's going to mean these people pay more, but these people are going to pay less because it's unfair. I think making that more principled stance about it's not about targeting you. It's about saying the system's not fair. It's not a level playing field. We're going to change the playing field. I think you can imagine a politician having a go at that.
And one argument I would use if I were them is to say this will help doctors, nurses and teachers. We all work in central London, and we all have the sorts of jobs that if we went for another job, the other job would probably be in central London. So we wouldn't have to move house. Whereas if you're a doctor or a teacher, the jobs are spread out over the place, and you're much more likely to have to move, or there are much more likely to be opportunities, greater opportunities, that come from moving. So doctors, teachers, nurses, these are groups the public like, would be disproportionate winners from abolishing stamp duty. So you've got to look out for those sort of political wins.
I'm thinking of other political wins and possible ways to make you disagree, but I'm not sure this is a good
It'll be hard.
Wealth taxes. What do you think? That's one of the other big ones raging in terms of the debate.
So I think wealth taxes are one of those bad zombie ideas that seem impossible to kill. Because first of all, they don't raise much money anywhere. I've had a look at these data, and the best you're getting is about 10 billion, and that's in Norway, where they're living it on people with wealth, including housing wealth, of £140,000. And when you look at the advocates of wealth taxes in Britain, they're not saying, oh, if your house is worth 150, I'm going to tax you more. They're claiming that, they can get this from people with 1, 5, 10 million. But those people, what worries me most is those people are internationally very mobile. I'm an economist, and economists are often very well off. So I have a couple of very well off friends, and they've almost all lived in more than one country in the course of their careers. They work for really big banks that will relocate them tomorrow to Frankfurt or New York or Singapore. And I really worry that if we go for those people, they can leave within a week. And when they go within a week, it's not just that we won't get the wealth tax from them, we won't get the income tax from them, we won't get the VAT, we won't get the charitable contributions. Now, of course, not all of these people make big charitable contributions, but some of them really do. And when you look at the Sunday Times list of the richest 10, 20, 30 people in Britain, and then you look at the Sunday Times list of the biggest donors in Britain, there is some overlap there. And that makes me nervous. You present me with a bill for 100 million to stay in this country, and much as I love this country, well, I don't know what I do because I don't have 100 million, so it's hard to put myself in those positions. But can I say, hand on heart, that I'm confident that everybody who'd be facing a bill of that size would say no?
Whatever you want for an annual tax, there are many taxes at the moment you want to fix, and you want to tax people getting high returns to wealth. So at least look here and do this as well. If you still want a tax on stock of wealth, don't underestimate the practical difficulties of doing that. And I don't just mean the fact that the government doesn't currently collect any information on wealth, so you need a whole new apparatus to do that. But also, some wealth is exceedingly difficult to value. So houses, actually very easy. Obviously, stocks, comparatively, stocks and shares, pretty easy. private businesses can be nightmarish. You can have a business where actually there's no other comparator, or things like influencers. Have an influencer, they might have a claim on a big stream of income in the future. Is that their wealth? What's the value of that? Wealth can fluctuate madly for some people. What do you want to do with that? So actually, don't underestimate the practical difficulty of actually pulling one of these things off. And as Tim said, note that most countries have had one, have got rid of it. Those that have them don't tend to have inheritance taxes or capital gains. They do it as alternatives rather than top. And if you do want to have a one-off wealth tax, I think there's 2 points about that. If you can do it such that everyone believes it's genuinely one-off, and they really believe you, it's never going to happen again, then it's economically efficient in the sense that it won't change behaviour. The question, therefore, is purely, is it fair or not? Is it fair that you're going to tax people who have wealth today and not the ones that had wealth yesterday and spent it or will have wealth in the future? And that's a political question. And you can decide whether you want to have that distributional outcome. But I would definitely say, why do people who want wealth taxes? That they start from somewhere understandable, which is to say, wealth inequality is undesirable in some ways. We don't like the level of wealth inequality. We don't like that some people get high returns and taxed less than other people. We want to fix that. Great. If you do that, I think you want to fix tax we've currently got.
You also want to distinguish between different forms of wealth. I don't think many people really mind the amazingly successful getting rich. Now, whether that's Adele or Taylor Swift or someone like that, or whether it's an entrepreneur like James Dyson. But if you're happy for those people to keep their wealth, then what you really dislike is inherited wealth, and you should sort out inheritance tax rather than all wealth. The other question is why we dislike people who save their money rather than spend it. The wealthy, in a sense, are the people who didn't spend their money. If we don't mind people who earn a lot and spend it immediately, why would we mind them not spending it immediately? Why is it better for me to spend all my money on parties than to keep it in the bank, investing in government stock, lowering the cost of the government debt? I don't really get that.
So we've talked about some of the difficult things and some of the big changes you would make. Are there any quick wins that you think are just sitting there ready to be made? Or changes rather that are ready to be made?
Well, Helen named an excellent change earlier, which is the pasty tax. The pasty tax was exactly the answer to your question. Because before the pasty tax came in, if you were a fish and chip shop, you had to levy VAT. If you were a supermarket, and at this point the supermarkets were beginning to have hot food counters, and they were selling roast chicken that was kept hot for a while, you didn't have to pay VAT. And the government, the civil service, said, well, this is unfair. These small fish and chip shops are being penalised compared to these big supermarkets. We will level the playing field with this tiny, no-brainer change. And then it got called the pasty tax, and it proved not to be a tiny, no-brainer change. So actually, I think the problem is that even when we come up with small changes that level the playing field, support small business, support businesses people like, they don't always prove to be no-brainers after all.
And actually, look, so I'm trying to think of a nice, easy, quick win. I'm not sure there are many. A few years ago, I would have said pensions and inheritance tax, where pension pots weren't in inheritance tax, and now they are. I think that's not a statement about whether you should have an inheritance tax or not. You can make a different case. But if you have one, then I think you want to apply it broadly to all assets, and therefore I would have actually put farmers in the same bucket as that. I think, again, conditional having an inheritance tax, apply it to all assets. So I'm sure I could think of a few other things that are in that spirit. But in some sense, the fact that they're small things also means they can have small impacts in some sense. So I think what I would be trying to do if I had the chance, almost not so much pick things that, I think the mindset of let's find the small things we'll get away with and no one will notice. Well, if they're not going to notice, it might have a big effect. So I think actually you need to be bold and work out, are you willing to do something and pick an area and actually do something that moves. And we haven't talked about environmental tax. That's another example there. This government said, so to be fair to them, I've said for my entire career, which is the best part of 2 decades now, they need to do something about road taxes, taxing vehicles, because we know that fuel usage is going to decline. They have now got a plan for introducing a tax on electric vehicles. I don't think it's a great plan, because I think that the reason to have a tax is congestion. The tax they have hasn't got anything to do with congestion, so it's not a great plan, but it's a plan. But okay, let's run with that. Let's think about, how could we modify that tax? How could that tax be brought out and then made to more linked to congestion? Or, currently the set of taxes, we've done this piece of work at IFS, on different emissions depending on who emits them and what kind of the source. It's all over the place. It's wild. Start thinking about, okay, how can we think of all different levies and how they all add up and make them a bit more sensible and a bit more uniform? So that's not easy in the sense that it's not just one small thing, but you could take an area and say, okay, we're here, we want to be there. What are the things we could do to start to move towards it?
I'll give you one clearer answer, though, having had a moment to reflect. There's an exemption from capital gains tax if you hold the asset until you die. Then you don't have to pay capital gains tax. That's pretty weird. So just as they put sorted out pensions at death, I think they should sort out capital gains at death as well.
Yeah, get rid of uplift.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
I want to touch on the point that you made. There's so much agreement.
Sorry, you've got two orthodox people who thought a lot about the tax system. You can't really expect that much disagreement here.
You in particular, Tim, talked about guts and bravery from politicians. How fair is that? Like, how much do you think it is that politicians have got comparatively less brave over time, if you say that there used to be more bigger, bolder reforms? And how much is it that, like, the sort of systems around the state have got more belligerent and therefore it's harder for them to make the change? Do you think this is squarely with the politicians?
Oh, absolutely. So I worked in government for 12 years. And when I went in, I started in the Department for Education. And we had Michael Gove, David Laws, Matt Hancock, Liz Truss and Edward Timpson as our Commons ministers. All 5 of those were brave and radical reformers. You may agree or disagree with what they did, but all of them got up in the morning and, as Michael Gove used to say, thought, like Lenin, how can I change the country I live in today? And when politicians think that, and they think it every day, and they think it with some reasonably consistent framework, they permeate the department. People in DFE knew that if they came up with a radical and bold idea, no matter which junior minister they were working for, they had a fair chance of getting support and a fair chance of getting support from the Secretary of State. And they knew that the Secretary of State had a lot of capital with the Prime Minister. So having bold ministers is liberating for the civil service. Now, it takes them a while to get to grips with that. They don't believe it to begin with. They think the minister will capitulate the first time someone lies down outside the building, which they used to sometimes outside of DFE to make it difficult to get in and out. But it doesn't take the civil service long to realise that when the minister says, I am a brave minister, they mean it or not.
Do you think our system of budgets and how we make and announce tax change makes it harder to be bolder? There's like, if you listen to, I was so bold to call it a competitor podcast, given that we're on episode 1, but if you listen to Ed Balls and George Osborne, they'll say having multiple budgets a year is brilliant, having it all to the Chancellor is brilliant, not interested in think single fiscal event's a bad idea. But there is a sort of argument that if you leave it to the sort of rabbit out of the hat nature of the budget and the briefing to the Sundays the week before, you intensify the heat around some of these changes. So do you think that makes it harder to be bolder, just the nature and the cycle of how we make policy?
So my take is that I'm not sure it makes it harder to be bolder. And in fact, why do we have 2 fiscal events even when politicians said we only have 1? It's because chancellors like their moment in the sun. It's their day to stand up in Parliament, to have the spotlight on them and to announce something. And in principle, there's no reason why that something couldn't be really bold, right? So you can imagine a chancellor using the opportunity to do something that's really big and radical. So I don't think it's quite the lack of boldness. I do, however, think that the multiple fiscal events is a problem. And I think it's a problem interacted with kind of the public finances in the last 15 or so years, where basically they've been tough. And the chancellors have had fiscal rules which are constraining, and therefore they are they're buffeting up the top of it. They're getting to the point where they have to do something. So, you do something, next fiscal event comes along, the forecast is either changed in a good way and basically given you what free money is seen as, like, you have more headroom, free money, I can spend some money, or the headroom is shrunk, all right, and they now need to tighten. So part of the sort of bad, what I would see as bad rushed policy, is because the kind of volatility of economic forecasts is being mainlined into policy volatility. And because tax is the lever that you can change quickly, you get a lot of tax policy that's, I had to tweak this and tweak that, and I had to remove the personal allowance at £100,000 because at a point in time I needed some money from the rich and that was an easy way to do it. So I think that the kind of the tight public finances and the multiple fiscal events have led to some much more volatility. layered on top of which comes in every budget, we need to have something for this group and something for that group, and businesses need something. And that sense of needing to give something to every group means you're always doing too much fiddling. And I think that's as much there. And again, that could be bold, but once you have to try and have these your list of people you're trying to please and give it to everybody, that lends itself towards lots of small things rather than in this budget, I'm touching nothing except from this thing. This is the thing we're tackling now, and I don't care that not everyone's got something. So I think it's the interaction of all those things, actually.
And if you were going to go big, would you do other countries? I was looking sort of Australia, New Zealand have got a habit of doing big reviews that sort of lay the ground for big changes to the system. Do you think that's a sort of cop out and you should just stand up as Chancellor and do it? Or do you think there's merit in those? As well, Sweden have expert committees that look into specific things. Would you go for any of those models? Or do you think, Tim, the Chancellor should stand up and say it?
The Chancellor should stand up and say it because, this is not a comment on the current Chancellor, it's a comment on any Chancellor. They cannot be sure if they'll still be Chancellor in 3 months, let alone a year or two when the expert committee reports. And I saw that in the Theresa May government. We were trying to do something in housing, and we managed to squeeze it in a bill at the last moment that was going through, and it did become law. But much of the advice was, we'll have another bill in the next session. But then she called an election, which she lost. And the ministers were changed, and the minister who was committed to that was no longer the minister. And if they'd have followed the advice to have a commission and think about it, it would never have happened. So I think that fierce urgency of now, you do not know how long you will be Chancellor for. You do not know, even if you are Chancellor, what the circumstances will be like next year. So if you can do it, go for it.
I think it's also important that, and I think we'll agree here again, Tim, these are ultimately political decisions. And I say that as someone who's been, who's got expertise. I've worked in tax for a long time. I'm a technocrat in that sense. These are not, and I think, experts add a lot in terms of what a well-designed structure. I mean, we wrote this big Merley's review, we've written books, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports we've written about how to design a tax system. I think there is use for that kind of work. But ultimately, I think a politician has to say, I'm going to do this, and I'm doing it for this reason, and I'm the one responsible for explaining it to the public, and I'm the one responsible for there are going to be some losers. I take responsibility for that, or I'm doing this rather than that. I don't think you can get an expert. You can't outsource that. So I think if a Chancellor said, here's my vision for this bit of the tax system, you can absolutely then consult on how to do some of the technocratic stuff. You could have a review of some sort that says, okay, here's the vision, here's how we're going to do it. Absolutely. But to say, an expert how to design the tax system, one, I'm not sure you'd learn very much. I think a lot of it's actually already been written. But also I think it makes it, but I think it makes it sound, and many of my predecessors, but I think it makes it sound like you can outsource the decision.
Yeah.
And again, I think politicians need to, I always get a bit depressed when people say things like, the public wouldn't take it. I think that's just really insulting, actually, to the public. The public aren't stupid. And of course, they're not tax experts. They're trying to get their tea on the table and stuff. They don't need to be tax experts. But I absolutely think that if politicians went out and made the case some of this stuff and explained it in clear language and said why we're doing it, I don't believe at all the story that the public wouldn't buy it. Of course, some people are going to hate it. Some people hate everything you're going to do. To govern is to choose, right?
Yeah.
So I think it absolutely has to be politicians that lead from the front and say, we're doing this for this reason, and I'm going to make the case for it, and I'm going to put my reputation on the line for this thing. And then you can get the experts to help you do it.
If this is a point of politicians being brave and grasping the nettle, why should they do it now?
Why not? They should do it now because they can do it now. There's never any benefit in delaying. Do it now. Get on with it. Seize the moment. You went into politics surely to make a difference and make big decisions. If that isn't why you went into politics, well, get out.
Okay, and then to add to that, I mean, look, I think yesterday was, I suppose, always the right time to do tax reform. Today's the next best time. It's also worth remembering that the government raises a huge amount of money. And actually, in the last, 5 or 6 years, it's increased revenue a lot. It's going to go up to a lot, a lot more. The government's going to be dragging in, not far off 40p in every pound in the economy. The more you raise, the more important it is that you raise it in a way that is as effective as possible. We talk a lot about efficient public services, get good value for money. We need good value for money in our tax system. We should be making sure we are not taking more money than we need to take from people, because to do so is to reduce living standards.
So last question is a curveball one, which is taking a break from tax. If you were the Prime Minister and you could only choose one policy from any area and you didn't care about being re-elected, what would you push through?
Can we not have stamp duty, if that's a tax? Because it might honestly be the one thing I would do. The legacy I would like is to get rid of stamp duty.
Fine, we'll give you that legacy.
Great. Sorry, I stole it. If we could have it, Tim.
No, that's fine. In terms of economics, I don't think there is a better policy than rejoining the European Union. I mean, the estimates of that are 4, 5, 6% of GDP. Now, of course, the problem with that policy is it's not really in the gift of the British government. And if I were Prime Minister for the day and announced it, you will just laugh at me. But you didn't say it had to be a policy that could be implemented. So that's my policy.
Fine. Helen Miller, Tim Leunig, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please do like, share and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Nesta is a research and innovation foundation based in the UK. We design, test and scale solutions to society's biggest challenges. We are funded by a charitable endowment and are politically neutral. If you want any more information, go to www.nesta.org.uk.